Europe's highest peak with no way to call for help. Some suffering from snow blindness and no GPS. What would you do? Continue to trek into the unknown. Hunker down and wait it out, or close your eyes and dream of your loved ones. 10 set out on that fateful alpine adventure. Only 3 made it home. Welcome to Surviving the Impossible. In the spring of 2018, disaster hit the slopes of Mont Blanc. A ski touring group became trapped on Western Europe's highest mountain. As bad weather struck the steep, icy slopes, visibility plummeted, and mistakes were made. This is their story. Ski touring has become big business in recent years, but it isn't anything new. In fact, it is an old sport that took off in Europe in the early 1900s. It was a way for people to walk across the snow-laden mountains from village to village, attaching skins to the base of the skis. People literally walk up the mountain with their skis on. The heels of their boots detach from the skis, so it is just like walking. Then, when they reach the top, they remove the skins and ski down the slopes. The achievement of summiting the highest peaks in the Alps is rewarded with the downhill ski on fresh powder with stunning backdrops. And Mont Blanc is no different. It lures thousands of skiers to its slopes every year. The Haute Route, also known as the Chamonix-Zermatt crossing, is desired by every ski tourer in Europe. It is the ultimate, the pinnacle of the ski touring challenges. Adventurous souls take on this challenge. Most make it back home afterwards. Some do not. It was a freezing cold morning at 6:30 on Sunday, April 29th, 2018. A group of 10 skiers, led by experienced ski touring guide 59-year-old Mario Castiglione and his wife Kalina Damjanova, set off for the next checkpoint. This checkpoint was a hut called Cabane de Vignette, and it was lying about 6 hours ski away from where they were now. The journey would take them higher up the mountain, navigating glaciers, cols, peaks, and the highly coveted slopes of unbroken snow. The group consisted of Italians, Swiss, and German tourists. It was evident early on that they were all of exceptional ability, and no one was going to hold the group back. But it wasn't their ability that proved to be their undoing. It was something they could not control: the weather. The hut they were leaving on that fateful morning was called Dick's, and it provided a surprising amount of luxury that high up on the mountain. After a long day climbing or ski touring, individuals cram into the stone cabin and are welcomed with comfy beds and pillows, hot meals, beer, and internet access. It is a cozy haven during the bleakest of winters, but the luxury was short-lived. Some of the more anxious people in the group had read the weather forecast for the day ahead. It was a gloomy outlook. A storm was coming in, and it looked like their trek to the next hut would be in jeopardy. Still, they put their trust in their veteran guide Mario, who had founded his own guiding company back in 1992. If anyone could navigate the tricky slopes of Mont Blanc, Mario could. The rest of the group stepped out of the Dick's hut door and followed Mario blindly. The climb for that day consisted of one big uphill climb, followed by one big downhill ski to the Vignette's hut. They were essentially going up and over a big saddle on the mountain. When they woke up that morning, the storm that had been forecast was nowhere to be seen. Instead, they were met with bright sunshine. It warmed their faces as they stepped outside and began their ascent. But it wouldn't last long. The good weather had lulled them into a false sense of security. The weather forecast in the Alps was rarely wrong. Mario was leading the group. He held his smartphone in his hand to navigate. a common practice amongst ski guides these days. But he should have also been carrying a backup GPS. Nobody knows if he was or not, but it's likely he wasn't. And looking back, that turned out to be a fatal mistake. After crossing a glacier, the team trudged uphill for 5 hours. They were on track. Mario had done this plenty of times before. He knew the route and he knew what to expect. In fact, he was so used to this kind of ski touring that perhaps he had become a little complacent. A deadly thing in the Alps. Mario was leading the team to the Pin de Rolla. It was a 12,500-foot peak, the highest elevation of the entire haute route, and usually promised exceptional views from the top. But for Mario's team, those views would never be seen. Once summiting, it was then a relatively easy 30 to 60-minute ski downhill to the Vignettes hut, their next resting place. But it's only easy in good weather. If the weather is bad, then it can be hell. With poor visibility, skiers can miss a couple of vital turnoffs. These can be the difference between life and death, as Mario and his team were about to find out. Stuck on one of Europe's highest peaks, in hurricane-force winds and sub-zero temperatures, a group of ski tourers fights to survive on Mont Blanc's formidable slopes. At one point, a few thousand feet into the descent, there is a fall line which looks like the route. But if you follow that, then you will plummet off a cliff, never to be seen again. Another challenge is finding a cairn that marks a passageway through the rocks and onto the hut. Miss the passageway, and you will be lost on the mountain, unable to go up and unable to go down. But in poor weather, the pile of rocks can be impossible to spot. What had started out as a standard uphill slog on skis in nice weather started to take a turn for the worse. Just 3 hours into the climb, the clouds came in. The sunlight was blocked out, and a chill descended over the mountain as it was thrown into shadow. Not only that, but the wind also began to pick up. The climbers were now entering the most exposed area on the mountain. At more than 12,000 feet, the wind chill was phenomenal. Despite the deteriorating conditions, Mario pushed on. Nobody would have blamed him for turning back, but at that point, it seemed that going forwards was the best option. It wasn't long before they were in blizzard conditions. Visibility dropped to just a few feet, and it was a case of putting one ski in front of the other, heads down, following the person in front. Then, disaster struck. Mario's phone stopped working. Either his GPS failed or his phone battery died. There is intermittent signal up in the Alps, but ski guides tend to switch their phones to airplane mode and rely on their GPS apps. For the most part, this works well, but when the phone dies, a common problem in the freezing conditions, a backup battery is essential, as well as an alternative GPS device. Luckily for the group, another member of the team, Italian Tommaso Piccioli, had his GPS with him. He looked at the screen in his handheld device, and he could see that Mario was leading them all over the place. They were leaving a zigzagging trail across the mountainside. It was clear that Mario was lost and didn't know which way to go. But was an experienced mountain guide, responsible for all those lives, really going to admit that he didn't know which way to go? Unlikely. When Tommaso saw Mario stop, looking lost, he called over to him, waving his own GPS. Mario waved it away. He didn't want to admit defeat. Minutes later, however, he stopped again and asked to see Tommaso's GPS. On it, they could see a route just ahead of them, and it led directly to the hut they were aiming for. But Tommaso hadn't expected to rely solely on his own GPS for the trip. Surely that was the job of the guide he had paid for. So, Tommaso hadn't downloaded the winter routes for crossing the haute route, only the summer ones. But is there a difference? Yes, a small one. But yet again, this small difference is the difference between life and death. A slightly different route is recommended through the winter months and the dense, thick snow. The snow was falling heavily now, but finally, just before midday, the group made the summit of Piña de Rola. Now all there was to do was ski down to the hut. But on the summit, with each person bowed against the howling gales, Mario realized skiing wasn't an option. The wind was so strong and the temperature so cold that the lunch break they had planned was canceled, and no one was allowed to ski. Instead, Mario instructed the team to take off their skis and strap on crampons instead. Now hiking down the mountain instead of skiing, the group stayed closer together and were more sure-footed, which was essential in those conditions. They weren't the only ones having difficulty up at Piña de Rola. A group of 4 French ski tourers were also struggling to find the correct route. They joined up with Mario's team, and now they were all solely relying on Tommaso's GPS as well. Mario tied a rope around his waist and let it trail behind him. He hoped that this would create a trail if the others lost sight of him. And losing sight of him was a very real possibility. The wind was so strong that it was impossible to fall over if you leaned fully against it. It had now reached 50 miles per hour, and the snow was falling thick and fast. This only added to the icy conditions. Nobody dared to stop in case they froze solid. The summer route they were following, the only one on Tommaso's GPS, was getting them lost. It was already nearly impossible to navigate in the conditions, but traveling on a route that they shouldn't even be following in the first place was leading them directly into danger. Although the GPS pinpointed their position, and if they zoomed out enough, the vignette's hut was tantalizingly close. The device didn't warn them of dangers such as crevasses or drop-offs. For those, they had to rely on their eyesight, something the blizzard wasn't allowing them to do. What had happened to the 60-minute descent the group had been looking forward to? Where had it gone? Despite the high expertise of the entire group, no one decided to turn back. That would have meant climbing back up to the summit and back down the other side. According to the GPS, they were so close to the hut that even when 60 minutes turned into multiple hours, nobody gave up. But they were running low on supplies. With barely any water left and no food, the team were beginning to fade, and they never found the crucial cairn or the passageway through the rocks. If they had made it into that narrow path, then it would have guided them all the way to the hut. But with no visibility, the group wandered helplessly above it, unable to make sense of where they were or how to get to the hut. By 8 p.m., darkness had closed in all around them. They were cloaked in the blackness of night, and Mario called a halt to their movements. Walking around on Mont Blanc in the pitch black was suicide. They would have to wait until daylight to try again. But would they be able to survive the tumultuous, frigid conditions without any shelter? Typically, mountaineers finding themselves in similar situations dig a hole in the snow to shelter them from the wind and cold. But the wind on Mont Blanc was now at hurricane speeds, and all the snow around them and beneath their feet had been blown away, exposing sharp, jagged rocks. There was no snow for them to dig into, and without that, their chances of survival were very bleak. Each team member carried a Mylar space blanket in their backpack. Not only would these enable them to retain some heat inside their bodies, but the reflective material would be a bonus if a rescue was mounted when conditions improved. But nobody took their blankets out. It was far too windy to open them up and crawl inside. They would have been ripped out of their hands before they even had a chance. All they could do was try to hide behind the rocks and last through the night. Tommaso began digging into the rocky ground. His shovel cracked against the stone, jarring his hands, but he continued to try and drive it downwards. Every muscle in his body ached. His throat was dry with thirst, and he was utterly exhausted physically and mentally. But something kept him going.
Think about your dears, and that makes the difference. Well, it made it for me. So I say, look, it's not fair, you know, if my wife loses me, it's not fair. So I have to avoid it. And that gave me the power to go further. It made me do the effort.
He managed to dig a small hollow into the ground, but this wasn't for him. He insisted 3 of the women, Francesca, Elisabetta, and Gabriella hunker down in the hollow to shield them from the worst of the storm. Others in the group tried to do the same, digging their own shallow holes in the rock, but it barely provided any shelter. Tommaso took it upon himself to check on everyone. When he scrambled over to their guide, Mario, he could see he was in a bad way. He couldn't see a thing. And it wasn't just the blizzard that was impairing his vision. He had snow blindness. Tommaso watched as Mario hunkered down, his backpack on his back, and rested his head on his knees. That was the last time he saw Mario. It was time for Tommaso to take shelter himself. He leant against a rock and gritted his teeth. The howling, swirling wind was all around him. The cold was so intense, Tommaso hadn't felt anything like it in his life before. Everything was telling him to close his eyes and fall asleep. His muscles were exhausted and sore. His mind was tired. It would have been so easy to slip into a deep sleep, forget about the chaos all around them, and never wake up. Everyone felt the same, and the decision whether to fall asleep or not was yet another life or death decision. As a thunderstorm cracked overhead, Tommaso kept his eyes open and focused on nothing except moving. Only very little movements, but just enough to keep his heart beating and his blood circulating.
You need to do, which is a technique, an alpinist technique, which is keeping you alive and awake doing these movements, or any movement. It can be this, can be like, but you have to be constant. You have to be, you have to think that you must do it for 10 hours, and that's the difficult thing. And you can't give it up.
That's all Tommaso did for the next 8 hours. He had to stay focused. He had to stay alive. A few times during the night, he thought to himself, what's the point? This is too hard. Just let go. But he didn't. The thought of his family kept him going. His wife, his mother, they would miss him, and his heart ached when he thought of how sad they would be losing him. As dawn broke, Tommaso looked all around him. He had made it through the hardest night of his life. But around him, bodies lay everywhere, covered in snow. Next to him, a German woman was still alive. Frozen from the buffeting wind, Tommaso pulled out his flask of tea and shared it with his fellow skier. The storm had passed, and the wind died down. The sky was overcast and gray, but the visibility was reasonably good. The others were either unconscious or dead. When Tommaso stood up, he saw the Vignette's hut. It wasn't that far away, but it was difficult to ski to. He hesitated, not knowing what to do. Should he attempt the journey by himself, or should he wait? It was an agonizing decision to make. He was running on empty. He hadn't eaten for more than 24 hours and had just survived a night of hurricane winds in icy conditions, well below zero. But those lying on the ground all around him, covered in snowdrifts, were relying on someone to rescue them. They had families waiting for them at home. Just then, the German woman gave a yell. She had spotted something in the distance. A small group of skiers were traversing the slope below them. Tommaso couldn't believe it. He immediately yelled out, crying for help at the top of his voice.
This group of skiers just underneath. I went there with my last energies, and I started yelling, and they saw me. And then I went back, wait, and after 15 minutes I saw people, rescuers around the camp.
After just 15 minutes, however, Tommaso heard a familiar sound that echoed all around him. It was the whirring of a helicopter, and it was coming his way. A massive rescue operation was now underway, and 7 helicopters flew in to rescue Tommaso and the rest of the team. For Mario the guide, though, it was too late. His body was found at the bottom of a large drop. It looked as though he had wandered off a ledge, unable to see, perhaps searching for his wife. 6 others made it all the way to hospital with severe hypothermia, but died a couple of days later. Of the 10 skiers that set out on the haute route, 7 didn't make it home to their families. It was an absolute tragedy, And that same weekend, a further 9 people lost their lives on Mont Blanc. The storm had taken so many lives, but for Mario's group, their disaster was entirely avoidable. Tommaso has since reflected on what went wrong. There were so many opportunities to turn back or question the guide, but no one did. The experience amongst the team was second to none. But because they had all hired an expert guide, they automatically left the decision-making to Mario. Nobody questioned him, and whilst Tommaso would usually take the lead on map reading on his own expeditions, for some reason, he stood back this time. There was also a lack of communication from Mario. He didn't share any information with the group, so they were effectively following him blindly up the mountain. They didn't know which route they were taking, or about any risks along the way. If Tommaso had known that they needed to rely on spotting a cairn to make it safely to the Vignette's hut, he would never have agreed to take that route. But that wasn't where Mario's lack of communication cost the team dearly. Each hut on Mont Blanc has a landline, but Mario didn't phone ahead to the Vignette's hut to ask if there was room for his group later that day. If he had phoned, then they would have told him of the dire weather conditions. The strong winds and heavy snowfall were already hitting that side of the mountain before Mario's team set off from Dick's hut. And Tommaso doesn't know why Mario chose the route he did. With a storm on the way, it seemed foolish to take the group up and over the peak. There was an alternative route to the Vignette's hut, which would have taken them down along a low route on the north side of the mountain. This would have been safer, and they could either have spent the night in a small village en route or hiked up to Vignette's if the weather allowed. A multitude of mistakes and bad decisions cost 7 people their lives that day. There was plenty of information available for the team and their leader to know the weather conditions they were heading into, the route they were taking, and the location of the Vignette's hut. But they trusted their guide, and trust can be a dangerous thing.